Welcome everybody. Happy Wednesday. It's been a wonderful year with the Peer Mentoring Works, and we're glad to be here today for our combined November-December meeting for the Peer Mentoring Works, Peer Mentoring Models for Transition Students with Disabilities. This is sort of the outline of what we'll do today. I'll do a few welcoming remarks, introduce Michael Garringer, our special guest. We'll then have a moderated panel and open discussion to take up today. So again, welcome everyone. I'm going to start with just a little bit of background for those of you joining us for the first time on what Peer Mentoring Works is and what the community of practice is. The Peer Mentoring Works community of practice connects a network of peer mentoring providers for the purpose of mentoring other providers to develop and expand peer mentoring programs as a VR service. The Peer Mentoring Works community of practice seeks to support peer mentoring services through advocacy, efficacy, and determination, identify emerging best practices, capture and share early success stories, build a library of resources and technical assistance materials, and explore the development of new tools and practices. Community of practice participants consist of a national community of peer mentoring program practitioners for youth and students with disabilities. That includes VR agencies, state administrators, transition program directors, community rehab service provider agencies, and nonprofit organizations that are providing peer mentoring in the community. Community rehab provider, peer mentoring coordinators, the peer mentors, and inclusive of all mentoring organizations. The graphic on the left of the screen represents that community of practice being supported by the Peer Mentoring Works tool suite and community of practice, which includes research and development and subject matter experts in evidence-based practices. And so that really is a nice introduction to what we're going to do today. And that is, we are here today to present a very special guest, Mike Garringer, and he's joining us today to do an incredible presentation. I think we'll all learn a lot about the research and effective practices of peer mentoring. Anyway, go ahead, next slide. So Mike Garringer is the Director of Research and Evaluation at Mentor. He has authored and edited many guidebooks and program tools to support youth peer mentoring, including the elements of effective practices for mentoring, the powers of relationship. This is a study on America's mentoring experiences. The examination of youth mentoring services across America is the most ambitious survey of youth mentoring programs to date. And Mentoring Youth with Disabilities, the National Mentoring Resource Center's population review and its implications for practice from October of 2018. Garringer is a proud alumni of the University of Oregon. He currently lives in Portland with his wife, 2 children, and 11 fish. Welcome, Mike. Thank you so much for being with us today. And the floor is yours, sir.
Awesome, thank you. And I realizing I need to update that profile. We've added a couple of lizards and some frogs since I last wrote that. So got a little virtual zoo happening here. So Steve, I'm assuming the slides are all going to be advanced by someone on your end. Is that correct here?
Yes.
Okay, great. We can go ahead and move on to the next slide here. We're going to be talking a little bit about peer mentoring practices and kind of going a little bit beyond just peer mentoring to talk about kind of both what mentoring program leaders can do, but also what individual mentors can do to best support young people that you're working with. Just a quick agenda and some goals for this session. I wanted to start off talking a little bit about how this pandemic has changed things for the mentoring field. I've got a little research I want to share around that. We're going to review some of the basics of effective mentoring practice. A lot of my work focuses on kind of what are the core elements that a quality mentoring program needs to be bringing to the table. We'll also talk about that down at the individual mentor level. What do you do when you're working directly with a young person? Then, given the work that you all do, we'll talk quite a bit about what works in peer mentoring, but also delivering mentoring virtually through technology. And then I'm hoping that we'll leave plenty of time here for Q&A, and I'm sure all of you have different contexts and issues that have bubbled up in your work over the last year. So I'm hoping that we can spend some time just problem solving and going a little bit deeper into the things that interest all of you. I also want to note that these slides, I'm fine with Steve sharing them with the group once this presentation is done. Some of them are pretty information heavy slides in terms of the amount of text. So just know that you'll be getting a copy of them if you want it, and no need to take furious notes. If you see a lot of words on the screen here, we'll be sending these out afterwards. You can go to the next slide, please. So I really wanted to, as I said, take a minute to talk a little bit about kind of just what's been happening in our field over the last 10 months now. I can go to the next slide. So I don't think I need to explain to any of you that the last 9 or 10 months has been a real challenge, not just for the world of mentoring, but the world in general. As you can imagine, a lot of the programmatic efforts out there have been suspended or closed or have shut down entirely due to funding or staffing challenges. Every program in the world has tried to find creative ways to keep matches meeting during social distance times. I think a sneaky impact of this is that a lot of the institutions, not only where formal programs happen, but where natural mentoring relationships are happening, are also closed down. Schools, after school programs, hobby clubs, sports and recreation, environments, faith environments, all have been impacted. And so young people are not only missing their programmatic mentors, but they're also missing those natural adults that they relied on for guidance as well. And certainly we've, I think, all understood the mental health toll that the last 10 months have taken on all of us. It's been a rough 2020. Hopefully there's light at the end of the tunnel in the form of a vaccine. But, like all aspects of life, this has been a tough year for the mentoring field. And I want to thank all of you for persevering through it and finding innovative and new ways to do your work in spite of all these challenges. You can go to the next slide. I just wanted to highlight a little bit of some research that Mentor has done. And for those that don't know Mentor as an organization, we are not a direct service provider. We don't actually mentor kids ourselves. We're more of an intermediary organization that supports the mentoring field in a variety of ways. So if you're kind of wondering about what our role is, we basically advocate for increased funding for mentoring and do help to do things that support programs. And certainly my angle is new research that helps us understand our field a little better. As you can see here, this was back in, I think, April, early May. We did a survey just to see how was the pandemic impacting folks. The good news at that time was that, almost half of mentors said, oh, this really isn't having much of an impact, or it's, a mixed bag. Some of it's harder, some of it's easier. But there was about a quarter of mentors that said this had a negative impact on our relationship. Most of that was due to program closures, social distancing that made meeting impossible, if not more challenging. You can go to the next slide. We did ask, at that time how programs were trying to handle staying in touch with each other. As you can see, unsurprisingly, things like Zoom and FaceTime were pretty popular. Good old-fashioned phone calls, those still exist in this text-heavy world. Those were working for quite a few folks. There was a small percentage that was meeting in person with no social distancing. I think this was done back at a time when the virus had not quite spread to rural areas in the way that it has since then. But you see 20% said, I'm not in contact with my mentee at all right now. And this included both natural mentors, but also programmatic ones as well. You can go to the next slide. We also did a survey of program staff in May of this year, and those practitioners said that they felt that less than 60% of their matches were in touch with each other, which was kind of a grim statistic at the time. They estimated that under 70% of their families had good technology in the home to participate in virtual mentoring. I think that's gotten better since then. I know school districts have done a lot of work providing students with, not only laptops and things, but also Wi-Fi hotspots and things of that nature. They've done a lot of creative solutions to keep matches engaged, and we'll talk about those a little bit later in the conversation here. But I was pretty impressed at the time at the wide variety of things that people were doing online. They weren't just sitting there staring at each other through the screen and trying to have a normal conversation. They were being more creative with things like Netflix watch parties and playing games online and that kind of thing. So that was pretty interesting to see. You can go to the next slide. And then lastly here, I'll just note that a researcher at Johns Hopkins, Michelle Kaufman, you'll hear her name a little bit later when we talk about the e-mentoring manual that we developed with her. She did a survey of focus groups of mentors from programs. This was over the summer, so a little bit more recent than some of this other data. And really here, unsurprisingly, there were a lot of needs expressed by both mentors and young people. And I'm sure some of these will be very familiar to you all in the work that you've been doing. Just mentors needing ideas on how to stay connected, tips for mentors on how to manage their own personal stress and burnout, right? Every mentor is also going through their own version of the pandemic in addition to trying to help someone else go through it. And I think for many mentors, that's been a tough, line to walk. I think in many cases, a lot of mentors that signed up for kind of what was supposed to be a fairly light and fun relationship was now turned into something where I'm talking to this young person about trauma and grief and maybe even the loss of a loved one from the virus. So they're taking on more than they had originally signed up for. The needs expressed by young people, I think are fairly obvious. A lot of families thrown into economic and other chaos by this. And really a mental health toll. Our nation's young people, I think we're already struggling at some level with mental health challenges at scale. And this unfortunately, ramped that up, maybe sometimes under some home conditions that were less than ideal, unfortunately. So you can go to the next slide. So I think, knowing the cohorts of young people that you all are working with, I think there were some things for older students that were particularly challenging this year, namely, very atypical transitions into college and career spaces. I've got a daughter of a friend of mine who's a freshman at the University of Minnesota, several thousand miles from home, and it's been a weird and strange transition, and it's always tough transitioning into higher ed, and even weirder this year. Obviously, the nation's been going through a lot more than just the pandemic over the last year. Many mentoring programs have been struggling on how to have conversations around race and social justice issues that have certainly bubbled up, rightfully so, over the last year. It's been a year of political unrest and turmoil that is still unfortunately continuing, but maybe ending soon. And certainly the economy, right? So if you're working with young people that are trying to balance jobs and school and stuff, all of that has gotten harder in the last year, in addition to reduced support from your peers, because you can't get together as easily and just kind of talk things through. And so, not to belabor the point, but this is a time when our young people need mentors the most, but the delivery of that mentoring has never been so challenging. And so I think everyone's just had to figure out ways to step up and do the work in spite of all of it. And I compared to other fields and industries, I think the mentoring field has done an outstanding job of responding to this crisis. I've been very heartened by the efforts of practitioners in doing this, and in talking with Steve and preparing for this meeting. It sure seems like the network that you all put together, your community of practice that you have, I know a lot of that wasn't built anticipating these problems, but I felt like your group is in pretty good shape to weather this and come out on the other side with some strong positive impact for kids. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I wanted to talk just briefly about effective practices for mentoring programs kind of broadly. And talking with Steve before this, he thought that kind of starting at a foundational level was probably a good place, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into peer mentoring and virtual mentoring, given that those are the topics of the day here. Go to the next slide, please. So a lot of my work over my career has been trying to look at research and help codify kind of what we know about mentoring and what we know about how to deliver it best. And I think the good news is that we have a mountain of evidence that mentoring can be effective at just about any outcome area that you can think of. A researcher named Liz Raposa and her colleague Jean Rhodes did a meta-analysis last year. And if you don't know what a meta-analysis is, it's basically a way of looking across multiple evaluations of many types of programs and kind of mushing them together and saying, if we look at these as a whole, what do they seem to achieve? And there was not a single outcome area that they looked at where they did not find evidence that mentoring kind of writ large has a positive impact. Now, some of those impacts were small, some were very big. A lot of the outcomes for young people with disabilities were quite large in comparison to other groups of young people and other types of outcomes. So plenty of good evidence here, but we also know that the practices that program staff and mentors themselves do really influence how impactful that work is. Now, a colleague of mine, Janice Coopersmith, found that the more programs adhere to certain evidence-based practices, and we'll talk about what those are in a minute, it really did translate into mentors feeling more efficacious about what they were doing, increased match length. So these relationships were lasting longer, and participants were reporting that it was a stronger and more high quality relationship that they were getting a lot out of. Other researchers like David Dubois have found similar correlations between the number of kind of proven practices a program is doing and things like match longevity or even youth outcomes. And so I'm fond of saying that really there is no cookie cutter approach to doing mentoring. I do believe that every program is a bit of a snowflake in reflecting their local capacity and resources and understanding of mentoring. But we certainly have some mother sauces. If you're familiar at all with French cuisine, there are these like core sauces that go into almost every dish that you make in certain European cooking, right? And so there are some basic things that I think the whole field builds on in its own idiosyncratic way, program to program. And that's what I'm going to talk about here for the next few minutes. Go to the next slide, please. So probably the signature publication of our organization is something called the Elements of Effective Practice for Mentoring. And if you're unfamiliar with this, it's a collection of research-informed practices for folks running youth mentoring programs. So this is kind of at the program leadership, program director, program coordinator level, not the individual mentor level. It's set around a set of standards under which each of them, there are benchmarks. And those are the things that we have solid research around saying, yeah, you really should be doing X in your program. We also have enhancements, things that research suggests might be helpful, but may not be applicable to every program, depending on their circumstances. We also offer some recommendations around program management and leadership and how to evaluate your program. But really, most of this is built around this set of 6 core standards. I'm just going to kind of walk folks through those now. If you can go to the next slide. So the first three of them, and I think you will see all of these reflected in your work. First is kind of recruiting the right folks to serve as mentors and to participate as mentees by really realistically explaining what the program can do for them, and kind of, is this a good fit? I think that then continues into screening, which seems at first like an off-putting word, like why am I screening people out of something where I want to welcome them in? And really this is just about determining, first, are mentors safe? Are they, kind of okay to be working with young and vulnerable populations? But also suitability, right? I think, obviously there are safety concerns when you're connecting strangers in a mentoring program, especially if one of those people is a young person. But really, I think most of this is around suitability. Does that mentor understand their role? Are they willing to learn and grow as individuals so they can do that job better? Are they bringing weird and negative biases? There is a segment of people that sign up to mentor children because they don't really think highly of children or their parents or the schools that the kids are in and want to kind of come in and fix that, right? So a lot of this screening is around making sure that everyone's a good fit for what they're going to get in the program. And then certainly, unsurprisingly, training is key, making sure that everyone understands their roles and responsibilities and how to handle certain circumstances. This was the one standard area that in Janice Cooper-Spitz's study proved to be most influential on the quality of those relationships and the length of those relationships. And, it's kind of common sense at some level. If you're unprepared for a job, you're probably not going to do it very well. So we really emphasize training in our work at Mentor. It sounds like the community of practice that you all put together is also pretty heavy on skill building and kind of knowledge transfers. So once again, I think that's something that this group appears to be doing quite well. If you could go to the next slide, please. I'll walk through kind of the other three standard areas. So there are a set of practices we recommend around how to make matches and how to get them off the ground. I think a lot of mentoring relationships that wind up not working out, it's because those first few meetings just didn't get off to a great start. And we'll talk a little bit about how that can happen if you're doing virtual mentoring, whether it's through video conferencing like this, or sometimes you'll find, text-based or email-based or message board, kind of bulletin board style mentoring platforms. Things can go really wrong when you're communicating in ways where you're not in person and can't read body language and tone and things like that. We then also talk a lot about this support of these matches once they get going. And unfortunately, many mentoring programs kind of stop worrying about their participants at the point of the match, which if you think about it, that's when the intervention or the service really starts, is when two people are matched and kind of off and meeting out in the world or on a screen or however they're going to meet. A lot of times practitioners shift, well, let's start recruiting the new batch. These folks are matched. We can now focus our attention elsewhere. And we really encourage programs not to do that, to really stay in the mix and offer ongoing training to mentors, help them problem solve. Very few mentoring relationships will go smoothly from day one. And there is kind of a natural cycle, a little push and pull that happens between mentors and young people. It often doesn't go according to plan, and you have to kind of change approaches and shift gears. And so that's hard to do if you're kind of not monitoring how it's going and offering relevant support as needed. And then lastly, and I don't want to gloss over this one because I think in some ways it's maybe one of the most important, if not the most important step, is closure. These relationships all come to an end. But I think a lot of times, once again, programs are like, well, this match is closing down. Let's focus on the matches that are going to be continuing forward. But a bad closure experience can really taint what young people take away from the experience, right? You can have a pretty positive mentoring relationship for quite some time, but then, the mentor gets a job in another city and has to move away. And if that goodbye gets kind of botched, I think it can be very hard for young people to feel positive about the whole experience. It kind of puts all the wisdom and guidance that mentor tried to provide them into a different light. It's like, well, should I really believe what that person was saying? Because they kind of, didn't even bother to say goodbye to me, right? And so I think we really encourage programs to really emphasize a good and meaningful closure process, even if it was a fairly negative experience and these two people just didn't hit it off and it was kind of a failed relationship. There's still teaching that can be done, especially with that young person, about how to handle it when relationships don't go according to plan in life. That's a great life skill to pass on. But in order to do that, programs have to be taking responsibility for ensuring that those closure steps happen in a good way. So those are the 6 kind of basic core areas. If you go to the next slide, there's a few other considerations I'd like to touch on. Well, first, we do have some supplements. So those are kind of the basics covered in the main document. We also have what we call supplements to that. And these are publications that were designed to provide even more research-based guidance for programs either with a specific focus or working with a specific population of young people. And you'll see here the topics that we've covered. Really the only one that's a kind of a population level one is we did work with Big Brothers Big Sisters of America on practices for making sure that programs were inclusive of LGBTQ plus youth, and feel very good about putting that resource out into the world. You'll see here we also mostly focused on kind of program models, right? So group mentoring, peer mentoring, STEM mentoring. The e-mentoring one we put out in February, right before the pandemic hit. And so it was both a timely resource, but also one that hadn't considered kind of the emergency situation and the need to deliver things virtually, like on the fly from a pandemic. We didn't know that was coming. In retrospect, it might have been nice to delay that for a month, and then we could have written to it a little bit more cleanly. But I think there's a lot of good information in there that does speak to the moment that we're all in, and we'll talk about that more here in a minute. If you could go to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to offer a couple other additional things that I think lead to quality mentoring services. And they're not really reflected in those 6 core elements that I mentioned, but I really think mentoring programs work best when they have a strong theory of change, meaning they can describe what a mentor is doing when they're working with a young person and the changes and kind of the causal pathway of changes that they think happens for that young person as a result of that mentoring. I unfortunately see a lot of mentoring programs that just assume that because you have a mentor, you're going to change certain behaviors or do certain things or achieve certain things if you're that young person, but they can't really explain how or why, right? I call that the hope and pray model. A good example of that is a program that says, well, one of our goals is to avoid teen pregnancy in the kids in our program. Well, how are you doing that? Like, are you talking about contraception? Are you talking about abstinence? Who's guiding that? What are you trying to get young people to change that might result in a reduced chance of teen pregnancy for those young people? If you can't explain that causal pathway, chances are you're going to miss the mark because you're probably not doing the right things to get there. I think it's especially important, and increasingly so as the years go by, to frame mentoring as not a top-down thing where I'm this wise mentor that's going to fill an empty vessel of a young person with knowledge and wisdom. I think mentoring works best when it's youth-led and youth-centered, and that young person is really in charge of what this relationship is about so that their needs are being met, right? I think oftentimes mentors come in and think their job is to either be a quasi-parent or some kind of authority figure. And I think those types of relationships are often fraught with peril, and young people, as they probably naturally should, tend to reject those kinds of mentors, right? So making sure that this is a collaborative thing where the youth has a strong voice in what's happening and what it's all about. I think cultural humility and responsiveness. Unfortunately, the demographics of our field largely are a lot of white mentors serving youth of color. And I think The last few years have really highlighted some blind spots that white America has around how it views its role in relation to people of color. And I think, the mentoring field for a long time had a bit of a savior syndrome complex going where, it was like, we're just going to helicopter middle-class people or upper middle-class people into economically depressed areas, and that'll fix everything. And it's, I think we need to move away from some of these paternalistic mindsets and things that really honor the culture and the backgrounds and the heritage and the life experiences of young people that we're serving. I also think things like staff development and retention, like most youth work and most nonprofits in general, there's a lot of turnover in our field. And I think the programs that are able to compensate and retain staff at a high level, those are the ones that I see thriving kind of through the ups and downs of running a company. And then ongoing evaluation. I wouldn't be the research guy if I didn't encourage programs to evaluate what they're doing and kind of take a continuous improvement mindset. If you can go to the next slide, please. So now I want to talk a little bit down kind of, we talked about a lot of things at the I'm running a program level. Now I want to go down to the I'm working with a young person and I'm sitting across a table or looking at them on a screen. What am I bringing to the table as a mentor? What are the things I need to be doing in that relationship? So if you can go to the next slide. Now, I'm not going to attempt to cover all the information on this slide, but I will tell you that this is a sneak peek of something that Mentor is working on. And in fact, you all are the first group of people external to Mentor to even see this. So I am going to ask that you don't share this externally beyond just this community of practice here. But I thought it was a good slide for kind of illustrating a broad set of principles that I think mentors need to bring to the table. And I'll start here at the bottom. You'll see that I think there's some very foundational mindset things that mentors need to be aware of. A lot of it I just mentioned, right? Things like cultural humility, authenticity, and acting, with honesty and honoring that young person's full self, things like that. Really do no harm philosophy, right? Mentoring cannot be a negative experience if we want young people to thrive. So keeping that in mind. There are also some basics about mentoring, right? So I think it helps to know a little bit about child and youth development, know your limitations and kind of temper your expectations. A lot of times mentors quit because they were expecting to totally turn around someone's life in 6 weeks or something, and it doesn't happen, and they get frustrated, but that's on them. That's their own outsized expectation. There was a quote in a book I read once that, people want mentoring to be a home run, but mentoring is often more like, playing Moneyball for those of you that are baseball fans. It's a series of singles and some stolen bases, and you make incremental progress rather than hitting a home run every time you're at bat. And then I think the big graphic up top here, kind of these smaller circles around kind of the core idea of having this be a beneficial relationship to the young person. Each of these circles represents a competency or a skill that I think mentors should have. And I'll just start at kind of the 12 o'clock position up top. I think the basis of being a good mentor, the foundation, is really providing emotional support, empathy, letting that young person know that they are loved and cared for. All the rest of this pivots off of that, I think, core ideal. Even in something that's, I think some of you are mentoring as a paid position where you're working with maybe a dozen kids or so and you're getting a salary for doing that. I still think providing emotional support and building a real human bond, it's got to be at the heart of this. Otherwise, you're just another employee giving that young person another to-do list, right? It stops being mentoring, I think, if that's missing. I won't go through all of these skills, but certainly I think the ones on the left-hand side, or the right-hand side of this graphic, I would consider to be relational skills. So making room for fun and play, even when working with college students, right? If these relationships are kind of a slog, I don't think folks are going to want to participate in it, right? So how can you weave in some fun, even if it's just a 5-minute icebreaker at the beginning of every meeting. Like, how can you make this a little engaging? You know, if you're working in a group setting, do you know how to manage that group, right? Is there kind of cohesion among the group, or do you have a few young people that just kind of stay in the corner and don't really participate, right? As you go kind of to the left side around the circle, I think you get into more and more kind of what I would call instrumental support skills. So can I help that young person set goals? Can I support their pursuit of those goals? Can I help them build their network of support? Can I increase the amount of social capital they have access to? Things like that. If you're doing something that's about behavior change, do I know how to use change talk strategies, motivational interviewing, things like that? So these are components that I think, you know, they don't apply equally to every relationship with every young person you'll have, but I do think these are a pretty good starting point on kind of what I would consider base skills for mentors. If you can go to the next slide. So I think additional considerations for working with your population of young people with disabilities. I don't need to explain to you all that services should be accessible in their design and delivery. I really think focusing mentoring, and I think this is true for the field writ large, I think times of transition, whether that's middle to high school to college, college into career, changing jobs within a career, whatever those transitions are, even personal relationship transitions, excuse me. I think those are critical points where young people need extra help. And I think those are areas where, particularly for youth with disabilities, supporting those transitions is a good idea. A lot of the research around mentoring for young people with disability focuses on notions of self-determination and kind of putting them in charge of not only the relationship, but also giving them the confidence that they've got control over aspects of their lives that they may not feel that they have that at this point in time. That's certainly not going to be in every program or every relationship, but if you look kind of at that body of research, largely a lot of what mentors do is building kind of self-efficacy and confidence for young people with disabilities. A lot of that also gets into advocating, but also teaching young people self-advocacy skills. And then there is a thread in that research around using technology if young people's disabilities makes it hard for them to meet in person, right? Using this as a value add. I think even in programs that are 100% virtual and participants are only meeting on a screen, there is always a desire to meet in person, right? And so I think I'm a big fan of, you know, blending in person and technology communication as much as possible. Unfortunately, things like a global pandemic make that harder. I did want to mention that this set of considerations was really authored by Janelle Thomas with a little help from me. She works with Derek at the National Youth with Disabilities Coalition. And we worked on a publication a few years back. It was mentioned very early on in my bio around kind of a research review of mentoring for youth with disabilities. So I wanted to mention that. The citation there is in the bottom corner. So if you could go to the next slide. I want to pause and see if there's any questions in the Q&A here. I'm just going to pull up the chat myself and see if there's any questions. Is there any research on effectiveness of mentoring starting with younger kids? So this is an interesting one. Most mentoring happens kind of late elementary school all the way up through young adulthood. I don't see many programs working with first graders, second graders, kindergartners or younger, although they are out there. I think one of the interesting things about mentoring, and it's kind of a almost philosophical thing, is can younger children of that age even know that they're being mentored, right? There is something about mentoring, and if you see this kind of throughout the age range, right? As kids get older, their perspective taking skills improve, right? And so anyone who's a parent of, a toddler knows that, sometimes you can't reason with a toddler or say, hey, you're impacting me, because developmentally their brains literally can't see something through someone else's lens, right? And so I think the developmental stage of young people really influences what they get out of mentoring. Now, I think on that younger end of the spectrum, you do see young people being able to say, well, I've got this new adult that cares about me and provides me with love and helps me with school. And, they get that they're being helped, but it's hard for them to differentiate that from a teacher or an after school provider or other adults, right? They just know that you're an adult who they like being around, and they're getting something, they feel positive about it, right? I think the older young people get, the more they're aware that they're being mentored, the more they need to have voice and agency in what the relationship's working on and kind of how this is unfolding. I think by the time you get to high school and college age and kind of young adulthood, these relationships need to be very goal focused. I think, there's very few teenagers that just want a buddy to hang out with, right? I mean, maybe some kids that have been through tough experiences need a relationship where they just feel safe and can be themselves. That's certainly, I think, reflected in a lot of the mentoring I see for, say, high school age young people. But in general, the older they get, the more they want this to be about helping them achieve something, about them reaching a goal, about what's important to them, right? And so they also naturally pull away from adults in those teen years, right? So that can be a tricky time to provide a mentoring relationship, but I also think it's essential if you can show them how it's impactful to them. So all of that to say, I don't see a lot of programs working with very, very young children, but we've got good evidence from, say, late elementary, 4th, 5th, 6th grade, all the way up through young adulthood. Mentoring is impactful there. It's just, you need to kind of shift gears and make it a little more instrumentally focused as they get older. So hope that answers that question. Was there anything else in the chat here? Kids become aware of their multiple identities and explore interests. Yes, all of that happens. I think really starting in middle school is where you start to see that shift. Kids start to think about kind of who they are at a bit of a deeper level. That's when they start pulling away from adults too. So that's a bit of a tricky situation, right? Right when they maybe need more of that guidance is right at the time where they're like, I just want to be with my friends. What do you grown-ups know about anything, right? So it can be a bit tricky. The one thing I will say, and I do think there's some evidence of this in the research, is that a lot of mentoring programs that are trying to do what I would call intervention work, where you're already working with young people that have had some negative circumstance or are struggling with something, there is a sentiment of thought that, boy, if you can reach them earlier and do more kind of primary prevention, you're going to be much better off. Like for a while, I was seeing a lot of these programs that were doing, kind of work with high school juniors and seniors to kind of get them caught up academically so that they might move on to higher ed. And it's like, well, if you're waiting till late in someone's junior year to find out that they need remedial instruction and all this extra support, that would have been a lot better off being dealt with back in elementary or middle school, right? And sometimes those issues don't present until later, but I think in general, the more this work can focus on prevention of, you see it also in programs focused on substance misuse, right? It's always better to prevent young people from ever even wanting to take, say, opioids than waiting until they've been taking opioids and then try and intervene and do something about it, right? So I think programs that can focus on the front end, obviously I think have a longer and better impact over time. Doesn't to say that you can't offer mentoring later on and really have that be a positive and corrective experience for young people, but I think those challenges just get tougher as young people get older and get into more serious trouble, right? So let's move on here. I've got a little bit more content to cover, and then we'll certainly pause and kind of have a deeper discussion. So peer mentoring, I wanted to focus on some things from the supplement we did on that topic that I think really strengthen peer mentoring models. So if you can go to the next slide. So we put out this supplement, as I mentioned earlier, to the Elements of Effective Practice, and the full publication, you can see the cover of it here. It's got a review of the literature. It's got a good section on kind of if you're going to be designing a program that uses peers, things you want to keep in mind. We then offer specific recommendations kind of within those 6 buckets of the standards that I mentioned earlier. So, additional guidance on benchmarks and enhancements that would make peer mentoring programs work. And then there's a lengthy section that we call the justification. If you're wondering why we're recommending doing something a certain way, we provide a really deep and rich kind of explanation from the research literature as to why we are recommending what we're recommending. These supplements also provide kind of snapshots of what this work looks like in real life programs. So if you're looking for some good examples of that, you can find it there. You can go to the next slide. So if you're wondering about the research that informed that, we did look at about 180 some program evaluations. You can kind of see the settings and kind of age ranges of these. I will note that on this particular one, there was a real distinction between peer mentoring being delivered for college age students. You see a lot of peer mentoring for like incoming freshmen being offered by upperclassmen or grad students or even external partners of the university. I feel like a lot of this group's work maybe falls into that bucket. But then there were a lot of programs, you see almost 70 of them here, where it was really like high school students mentoring middle or elementary, a few examples of middle to elementary, just a handful of like 5th graders mentoring 1st graders, that kind of thing. And so ultimately we had to kind of pick one of those 2 buckets to write this guide to. We chose kind of more the K-12 population just because more of Mentor's own client base essentially works in that space. Our funders on the project actually were more interested in the college level stuff. So I do have a slide in here that speaks more to that. But if you pick this up and you're like, oh, this seems more like for people working with middle schoolers, like there's a reason why. We just had to kind of, because the practices for one didn't necessarily translate perfectly well to the other. You can go to the next slide. So I think we found lots of good evidence of benefits in here for young people. I think there were lots of things around connectedness and feelings of community, feelings of belonging, lots of it around school. Almost all of these programs were site-based at some level. I think a lot of this group is doing what might be kind of thought of as community-based peer mentoring, where you're not meeting at a school every day necessarily. So that's a little bit different here, but certainly when this is done at a school location or other location, there's a real sense of community and social support and engagement that happens. There was a good amount of research around improved health behaviors, a little bit around improved academic behaviors as well, but these programs seem to be really good at using that peer influence, right? We always think of, peer influence as being negative about like starting smoking or something like that. But you can actually, kind of turn that around and use the influence of peers for all kinds of positive behavior change as well. For mentors, and I will say that some of these programs seem to be almost geared towards the benefits of the peer mentors and that they were helping build their leadership skills, their identity, things like that. There were some improvements in things like grades and achievement, self-esteem, engagement in the community. So I do think one of the benefits of these programs is that you can have value add for both participants, right? The older young people doing the mentoring and the younger kids getting something out of it as well. You can go to the next slide, please. So if I was running a peer mentoring program, what I would focus on is in those relationships, I would really emphasize relationship building first. I think unless you're doing some very short-term mentoring thing where it's only going to last a quarter of the school year and we just got to get some work done, I think it's always good to spend a lot of time up front just getting to know each other and establishing that base so that you can then build on that with some more focused work. A lot in the literature around the availability of peer mentors, because oftentimes, particularly if it's, say, high school students, the natural inclination is to like, well, let's get the honor students and the students that the faculty knows we can trust and they'll do a good job. And they often will, but those also tend to be the kids that are overscheduled with sports and band practice and SAT prep. And, you know, if you're picking young leaders, well, young leaders have busy schedules, right? And there was a lot in the literature about them ultimately not being full participants in the mentoring that they were being asked to do because they just had a hard time fitting it into their schedules. Needless to say, peer mentors, if you're using younger people in this kind of wise elder role, that's a little unfamiliar to someone who's a young person still themselves. And so lots of training and supervision, lots of help on how to handle challenges that come up. If it's a very hands-on program where you're doing skill building, making sure that they know how to do the activities. Even if it's something I think in a lot of the work that you all are doing, there is kind of a set flow to the subject matter that you're talking with young people about, just making sure that they know how to have those conversations, that they have not only a script, but they can kind of improvise based on what the young person they're mentoring says back to them. And then, you know, I think once again, this might be more for using younger kids in that mentor role, but you do have to pay attention to kind of negative peer influences. And, you know, you don't want them talking about the kegger they were at last weekend with their elementary school mentee and so being a bad example. A lot of logistical considerations around site-based programs. So if you're taking high school kids to the elementary school, does the elementary school know you're coming that day? Is the gymnasium actually available for them to meet in, or the library, or whatever it may be? And I think the best examples of peer mentoring I see really empower those peer mentors to help improve the program over time, right? So, hey, this activity didn't work, or we've been having trouble with this type of conversation. You know, as program coordinators, really hearing that and working with the mentors, shift gears and kind of letting them own the program at some level. I think it's a good best practice. You can go to the next slide. And then I think for you all working, I think more with a young adult population, there's some things that I think really stood out in that mentoring of college age young people by slightly older peers that I want to highlight for you all. One is I think the clarity of the mentor's role so that everyone understands kind of this is my role and this isn't. Some young people wanted a mentor who would help them figure out the social aspects of campus life. Others wanted a mentor that would help them figure out academic stuff and how do I get the most out of the classes I'm taking, or you know, where do I find stuff in the library and that kind of stuff. And mentors often came into it too with different motivations. So really making sure that everyone's clear up front on what this is about and the role that that mentor is going to be playing or not playing, making sure that everyone's clear on that. I think having a diverse pool of mentors. Now, I often get asked, you know, should we be doing cross gender matching? Should we be doing cross race or background matching? And there is no right answer on it. I think in some academic contexts, it's really helpful for a young person to see an older peer who maybe looks like them or has the same background as them so that they can kind of see their future potential self in that person. But I tend to think that good mentoring is good mentoring, and that as long as that mentor is bringing, you know, kind of understanding and empathy to the role, that you don't necessarily need to be matching on kind of surface level similarities, but it can't hurt, right? It's often I think, an important consideration. There is some tricky things around, like, how rigid should this experience be? As I mentioned earlier, if this is just a rigid, hey, it's week 10 and week 10's activity is this, and we're going to do high water no matter what's happening in our personal lives, that might get a little stale and feel a little by the numbers to participants. On the other hand, if you give them ultimate flexibility and they can kind of do anything they want anytime, you run the risk of them not doing important components of the program. And so in talking with Steve, it sounds like you all have found a good balance of what I like to call kind of fidelity with flexibility, where, yeah, there's some specific things we need you to do when mentoring this young person. But, you know, if they show up to your meeting one day and they're upset about something that happened, or they have a concern about something, it's okay to shift gears or hit a pause button. And I think, you know, trying to find that right balance between adherence to requirements, but also recognizing the humanness of this relationship, I think that's really important. And then, you know, I think I already mentioned this, getting feedback from mentors for program improvement. I think the programs that I see struggling the most are the ones that are, say, do it our way or don't do it at all, and are afraid to learn and adapt and grow. And I certainly think the community of practice approach you all are taking tells me that you're already doing pretty good on that front. So I want to move forward here. And Steve, I don't know if we're getting a little right on time here. If you can go to the next slide. I do want to take just a few minutes to talk about e-mentoring, and I think this is my last little set of slides here, and then we can open this up to more conversation. So you may be wondering, like, what do we know about delivering mentoring virtually? Same with all these other supplements. We did a nice literature review. There was a little less to look at on e-mentoring, but we did find about 70 some resources in total. A lack of like real rigorous research. So we didn't see a lot of experimental designs where you'd really test, you know, mentoring versus no mentoring and see how that shakes out. There's a variety of reasons for that. But you can kind of see the age ranges here too. Once again, most of it for middle or high school or transitioning into college and career. Go to the next slide. So if you're wondering, you know, does e-mentoring work? Is it as good as in-person mentoring? I think that's a bit of an open question. And I mentioned Michelle Kaufman earlier. She was the researcher that I worked with to put together this guide. And we've got a couple of studies that we're trying to find money for currently right now to answer this very question. What happens if I take a group of young people? Some of them get in-person mentoring, some of them get e-mentoring, some of them get no mentoring, and we see how that goes. You might think that type of study has been done before, but it really hasn't. And so, you know, we don't have a lot of great research to answer that question. It's also complicated by the fact that most of the research we looked at was about technology that has already been rendered kind of moot by, you know, the smartphone that we all have in our pockets now. It was hilarious almost reading about these, you know, studies of these kind of email-based, you know, message boards and things where they were just crowing about all the technology features. And, you know, some of these were, you know, papers were only like 6, 7, 8 years old. And already the technology they were using had been completely replaced by Zoom and chat and TikTok and, you know, social media and all these other things. And so it's kind of hard to say, but I think if you look, you know, across the spectrum, and unfortunately my colors on these arrows got a little changed in this slide deck, but wherever you see kind of a green arrow, we've got good evidence that mentoring is good around things, or e-mentoring is good around things like feelings of belonging and reducing feelings of isolation. I think this is particularly true for young people with disabilities. Providing access to subject matter expertise. So if I live in a rural area, being able to connect with a scientist or an expert in a field who's 1,000 miles away, that's a heck of a gift, right? Places where you see brown arrows or the blue arrow there, I think was red originally. Those are places where we had evidence of this not working or kind of a mixed bag, right? Sometimes these programs are very good around increasing feelings of emotional support or feelings of self-efficacy. Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they help kids build networks. Sometimes they didn't. So for some of these, it was a real mixed bag. I think the one where you see the two up green arrows at the bottom there, almost across the board, these programs are good at providing mentees with a safe space to share and process their feelings. And I think that's particularly important for young people with disabilities that encounter barriers, unfortunately, in trying to thrive. And I just think if your mentors can do nothing but provide a place where they feel welcomed and like they belong and where they can kind of just talk all of this through and get some good advice, I think you're already winning half the battle there. And there was a lot of evidence that e-mentoring, you can do that virtually pretty well. Can go to the next slide, please. So we talk a lot in this supplement, and I think this is where I'm going to end, is kind of what influences the effectiveness of virtual mentoring, right? I think there's a big picture thing between what the mentee needs and what's being done with the technology, right? These programs are great at reaching isolated young people, as I just said. So we would see examples in the literature of like young people who were in a wing of a hospital dealing with some disease, being able to interact virtually with adults who had that disease themselves as a young person and came through it, and or maybe are still dealing with it today, and kind of normalizing that experience. That's a good example of there being good alignment. You couldn't get mentoring otherwise, right? Because people maybe can't visit you in the hospital like that. Where it didn't seem to work, and where I think we have the biggest unknown, is kind of what you might think of as kind of whole child, whole person mentoring, where I'm your mentor and I'm here for kind of whatever you need. We really don't know whether you can build that sense of almost being like a family member, right? I mean, the ideal mentoring relationship, I think, is something that is as close as possible to a kinship-like relationship, right? Like you're a member of my family almost. We don't know how well that can be done via technology. Certainly it happens, and I've seen examples of it in my own life, but whether it happens at scale and consistently enough, we kind of don't know. I think technology literacy, right? I saw a lot of programs that shifted to e-mentoring when the pandemic hit that had older mentors that were uncomfortable using Zoom or didn't know how to share their screen or couldn't get the login right. And, the more unfamiliar people are with the platform being used, the tougher it's going to be. I think for this time, you also have the situation of, is that technology being used in a space where that young person can truly be honest and talk openly, right? So if you're mentoring a high school student or a college student and their biggest concern is that they hate the person they're sharing their dorm room with or something, but the person's sitting right there while you're talking to them, they can't really say what they want to say, right? And so there's privacy and access issues there as well. I already mentioned the importance of training, so I won't reiterate it here, but not only do you need to train them to be good mentors, you need to train them how to do this using whatever technology is going to be used. Conversational compatibility, frequency of interactions. So there was a lot of examples. If you're using a text-heavy platform, I mean, I think all of us have gotten emails or texts where we kind of misinterpreted the tone or tenor of it. I think that's really important in e-mentoring, right? It's very easy to send a message that is misinterpreted by the mentee, and then you got to kind of walk back and make sure that you didn't anger them. Those types of problems are obviously exacerbated. I think this type of video conferencing that we're all doing right now is probably a better way to go. I can at least read a facial expression, but there are also issues around just kind of frequency of communication, period. And so I think folks running an e-mentoring program need to be providing those matches with lots of prompts, conversation starters, reminders to keep in touch. And if your platform allows it, really monitoring how often matches are in touch, right? If you can look and see, well, I don't think these two have even sent each other an email for 2 weeks, that's a relationship that's probably in some trouble, right? There is unfortunately a bit of an out of sight, out of mind thing that happens when you're not tethered to an in-person meeting, right? So I think for those of you running these sites, really make sure that you're checking in with folks, making sure that they're meeting as often as they should. And if you do have a young person that reaches out to you, especially via email or other text message, you got to respond fairly quickly, because there was a lot in the literature around young people feeling abandoned when their mentor didn't write them back. And look, sometimes you're at work and can't respond to them, or sometimes they text you at 1 in the morning when something's on their mind and you're asleep. But if you're not responding to those messages as promptly as you can, you're going to be sending a message to that young person that they're not important. And a lot of that can really be misconstrued and taken more harshly than you may have meant it as a mentor. And I mentioned this early on in this conversation, even in programs that had an excellent technology platform and people were getting a lot out of it, one of the weird things that happened was the more they enjoyed that virtual relationship, the more they wanted to meet in person. And I believe that most all of you are doing a blend of in-person and virtual. So maybe this isn't a big of a concern, but I think as that relationship gets stronger and people realize that they've got a real mutual connection, they don't want to be typing to each other. They want to sit down over a cup of coffee and talk, right? And really be in relationship with one another. And so just being aware of that as a thing that may bubble up if you're doing this purely virtually. Obviously, don't break any social guidelines to meet in person, but it is something that we saw pretty strongly in the literature. So I don't know if I have one more slide here, but you can move forward a little bit. Just some quick things to keep in mind. I think I've touched on most of this already. Phone calls, video conferencing. I think most programs can get by with these for now. I know a lot of programs had rules around you weren't allowed to contact your mentee at home, or in many cases, you weren't even allowed to know their phone number or email address. And I've encouraged a lot of programs to maybe worry a little bit less about some of those predator safety concerns. I mean, obviously, if you're working with really young and vulnerable children, obviously that's an issue. But, I think this is a time where I would err on the side of making sure that young people know that they've got someone who's caring about them, that's checking in with them. I think that's important. So I have seen some programs relax some of those policies that may have prevented more virtual connection. I think we're still, unfortunately, in a stage where we got to help young people process their emotions and maybe just provide them with a little bit of fun and something to lighten the mood a little bit. It's been a grim year on a lot of fronts, and I think a relationship and a conversation that I can look forward to every week is a real bonus for a young person, and probably for that mentor too, to be honest. And then I think for the population you're working with, older young people that are in the middle of transitional points in their lives, helping them problem solve, right? They may be thinking about a career that's been in a field that's been very impacted by COVID. So do they want to shift careers? If they've been laid off from a job, how can they find other forms of employment in a time when the economy seems to be in rough shape? These are the things practically that I think mentors can really help problem solve. And then I think just one last thing is to just recognize that none of us are operating at full capacity these days. A colleague of mine in a staff meeting at our own company, pushed back on some plans that we had and said, not everyone in this world is a first responder in terms of their mentality, right? We all want to step up to help children and young people thrive, but we can't do that if we're struggling ourselves. And so just really keeping that in mind, that, not everyone's going to be operating at full capacity or handling this as well as others, and making sure that we're all just taking care of ourselves and taking care of each other so that we can do whatever the best work we can do is during this challenge. So I believe that was my last slide. Move forward, maybe one more here. Yes. In the words of Homer Simpson, can you repeat the part of the stuff where you said all about the things? So a little humor to end my presentation, but thanks for listening. I know that was a lot of content, but I'm happy to answer any questions you all have, particularly challenges you're having if you're wondering how to tackle something that's bubbled up in your work with young people. I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions. I'll check the chat here to see. Let's see.
Hey, Mike, this is Derek Shields. I'm going to jump in and help moderate the rest of the time we have.
Yeah, if you could, Derek. That's yeah. I'm trying to scroll through the chat panel here. I at least one question.
So we have one question coming in, and we're going to get to that. We're also going to bring in a couple other practitioners to have a bit of a shared view on this. So obviously, everyone, hi everyone, I'm Derek Shields. I've had the opportunity to work on peer mentoring works and with the National Disability Mentoring Coalition, and Mike Garringer for a few years. So it's great to be with everybody today. What we're going to do is add in a couple other perspectives, and we're also going to answer your questions. But to do that, what I'd like to do is go to the next slide. You all met Steve, and Steve will contribute as he has been as the founder of Peer Mentoring Works and the president of Policy Works. We're also going to loop in Kristen Humphrey. She's the manager of the National Disability Mentoring Coalition and the mentoring director for Partners for Youth with Disabilities, so a practitioner. We're going to bring in Horace Grant as well from the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation in the state of Florida. And there, Horace is on the screen. So first, just to pivot here, I guess I'd like to ask Kristen a question as a practitioner. Hearing Mike's presentation in the body of work that's really gone down in research, looking at the intersections of effective practices, peer mentoring, virtual mentoring, and youth and young adults with disabilities. So from your perspective as a practitioner, what stands out the most? What are the challenges that you're seeing as a practitioner? Mike's talking about some solutions that you could bring in and call out for folks. We have 11 representatives from 11 different states, and they're all at different points in developing their mentoring programs. So Kristen, quick introduction of yourself, and then call out a couple things that really resonated from your perspective.
Great. Hi, everyone. Well, that was a fantastic presentation. So I really enjoyed it. And as Derek mentioned, I've been with PYD for a little over 10 years. And so the intersection of disability mentoring. And a lot of the points resonated. I think the importance of being adaptable and flexible in this unprecedented time, and really to the point about how to adapt training as well with the trauma that mentors are experiencing, and that idea you can't pour from an empty cup of emphasizing self-care on the mentor level, on the staff level, and how important that is during this time. That really stood out to me in terms of a few things that we've done related to remote mentoring, really increasing the support during this time. So fun was mentioned a lot. So having more webinars, even virtual game nights, open mic nights, and you are able to do more with it being virtual in terms of scheduling wise. So I think that's really important. And then doing things like remote activity resources guides, just really emphasizing the support for mentors and mentees.
That's awesome, Kristen. So have you felt any drop off in your connections or in your matches, or have you found the ability to sustain steady state or any increase?
Yes, that's a good question. So in some ways, we've seen examples of matches being connecting even more. And I think just there's such a need and desire for connection and doing FaceTime and texting. So that has been a positive. We've seen the need in terms of programming and how we've had to adapt is to see where the technology gaps are. So one thing that we've done is created partnerships with corporations and to get donations for laptops where that's needed. So that is a challenge in terms of connection, but I think increasing the support really has helped to kind of maintain those connections. And probably one of the more challenging times out of so we have new matches, we have longer term matches. I think it can be particularly challenging the matches that started right as the pandemic was happening, just in terms of expectations and not having quite that foundation. But finding ways to emphasize the support has really helped maintain those relationships.
Nice. And final point here, how many relationships do you currently have active?
We have around 100 active matches, but ranging from longer term ones to newer matches. And we actually are making new matches, and everything is virtual. So virtual interviews, training, match meetings, closure celebrations, everything has been shifted. And we were lucky that we had infrastructure for that beforehand. But yeah, it's been great to see how mentors have adapted and mentees and really just taken on this new shift.
And the fun point, you also hosted your party for PYD online, and you recognized your Mentor of the Year online. So you pivoted the whole thing, including your parties. So well done. Let's go to Patricia's question, and then after this, we'll get to Horace. So Patricia's asking, Mike, can you speak to the unique challenges of work-based mentoring, pairing business leaders with young adult mentees? And I assume this is unique challenges during this COVID pandemic era.
Yeah, I think we also have, and I didn't really touch on it much here, but we do have a supplement that is around workforce focused mentoring. So I encourage folks to download that and look at that. I mean, that's full of the types of kind of practical advice that you saw around peer mentoring and e-mentoring here. I think I would quickly say, for workforce mentoring, I think really emphasizing training of not only the mentor, who I'm assuming would be like an employee that would be kind of onboarding this young person to a work environment. We do a training at Mentor called Connect, Focus, Grow. And we do that with corporations and businesses that are bringing in young people to kind of be junior employees or interns, or in some cases, summer employment, where you bring in a lot of young people. If anyone here is interested in that, by the way, I can connect you with our folks that do that training. We actually have a national initiative right now where we're working with corporations and companies to train their workplace mentors on exactly what it says. Can I connect with this young person at a personal and relational level? Can I then figure out what's important to them? That's the focus part, right? Can I figure out what their hopes and dreams are, right? And one of our early partners in that work was Starbucks. And it's like, hey, being a barista is a nice job for a while, but I don't think anyone still wants to be a barista at age 50 and making close to minimum wage, right? So where do you want to go from here? And then the grow part is really, how do I support them as they pursue whatever it is they're going to pursue, even if it means they were to leave my company and I'd have to replace them with a different employee, right? That's a good outcome in those situations. I think the main thing that I would emphasize in that training is to really ensure that, two things. One is that getting those mentors to understand themselves, their own biases, their own backgrounds. I think most mentoring relationships that struggle, but I think it gets really acute in a workplace, is, do I understand the biases that I'm bringing to this young person who might be very different than me, has probably never worked in an environment like this before, may not know protocols of workplaces and things. How can I bring a judgment-free and open mind kind of attitude to this relationship? I think getting mentors to really check where they're coming from will make them a lot more open to being a supportive person rather than kind of, as I mentioned earlier, a top-down authority person. Kind of closely tied to that is there is some suggestion in the literature that your workplace mentor probably shouldn't be your actual supervisor. A lot of companies conflate those roles, and I think that's a really difficult dual hat for a supervisor to wear, because a supervisor often does have to kind of correct your job performance or talk to you about things that you're not doing well. And if you're also then trying to be this support person, that can become really mixed. Now, the best managers that we've probably all had in our own jobs have probably worn those hats equally well, but not everyone can. And so I think making sure that that mentor is someone who's a little bit distinct from kind of the institutional authority structure, I think is a good practice. For the young people, I think I would really encourage them to not just rely on the one mentor that, say, the program or the company's providing, but there's a lot of research around informal relationships with others in that workspace, sometimes being more valuable than that kind of official mentor. There's a lot in there about, people kind of find mentoring where they need it, right? And so if I'm not getting along terribly well with my mentor, maybe I met someone in the break room who was actually willing to give me, the real truth about working at this company, those types of relationships. So encouraging young people to be what we call mentor magnets, right? Build up their skills on how to ask for help, how to engage others in being a support to them. Those are important things I would emphasize in workplaces too. But that other supplement I just mentioned is chock full of information that I think will be helpful to workplace contexts.
Super. Thanks, Mike. Great answer. And yeah, I just talked with SAP yesterday and their Autism at Work global leader. They embed a mentor match in their employment arena that's not the supervisor, and a buddy. And the buddy is another employee that has autism.
Yep.
So it's a
Yep.
great example of what you just described.
Yep.
All right, let's, Mike, you got a question in chat. Read that. And I'm going to go now to Horace, though. So we'll come back to you in a second. Horace, with the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation in the state of Florida, and you've been attending the Peer Mentoring Works Community of Practice. I really caught notice of your comment when Mike was dropping some golden nuggets about this year being challenging and how mentors need to check biases and think about position and influence. So you've been leading the country in peer mentoring models through the state of Florida from my perspective. And at this time, we brought up a couple themes earlier: periods of transition, self-determination, and identity. Anything that struck you from Mike's comments and the work you're doing that you'd like to share with us in those areas?
It's funny you say that, Derek. Those were some of the key highlight points I wrote down to talk about, is because here in Florida, I think that has been a big focal point, those periods of transition, understanding how youth peer mentoring affects individuals, particularly this year. I like to think of it from an aspect of this year in particularly was out of the norm, as far as our social interaction, engagement, everything was different. So it was something we never seen before. And for our ability to adapt and modify our programs to still accommodate and assist those individuals and those students in this program, in our youth peer mentoring program, has been a great benefit. With the help, of course, of Steve Allen, we managed to do a great deal of work with some of the numbers that we had, particularly the numbers of referrals we received for this year is a total of 66 referrals, new referrals coming in as a cumulative. Of course, we have on deck, we have approximately 83 new youth peer mentors, and we have 67 peer mentor coordinators across the state, as well as 46 providers of this service. So we've been seeing steady improvements across the state with youth peer mentoring. We're happy in the direction we're moving towards. Moving into next year, we actually have some plans in tackling that period of transition, and also looking at the aspect of transitioning from high school to college and providing more supports on that level, on a collegiate level. So we're definitely looking at other additional components of youth peer mentoring, as well as from a work-based experience, as far as doing an apprenticeship, mentoring. We're looking at all those different aspects. And I tell you, Mike, you're a hard act to follow. I really appreciate all the information that you gave us today. It was very, very informative. I will take this back with me and regroup some of the strategies that we had, because I tell you, I really enjoyed this presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Horace. And we appreciate your leadership in this and trying to change the model really and make peer mentoring a bit of a workforce for a transition to work. And, you know, as we remind everyone, our population works at 40% less than non-disabled individuals. And so can peer mentoring be the policy change? And we appreciate the work that Paul Hippolytus has done in this out in California. And we have Kathleen Lee with us from Cornell, who's been leading the way in a variety of mentoring models for years. So all of us working together is affecting that change. Let's go back to Mike. Mike, you know, the question came in from Jenny about group mentoring. I saw you were able to answer John's question in chat, but maybe a beat on group mentoring, and then I think we'll go back to Steve and wrap up.
Yeah, I think, and I'm just going to read the last bit of your question here, Jenny, real quick. Yeah, group mentoring. So I think group mentoring is probably one of the tougher things to do virtually. I know that for a lot of group programs that we're meeting in person, say at a school or a work site or whatever, I think a lot of the magic of group mentoring happens through the interaction that those young people have with themselves, as much as it is kind of that top-down mentor infusing wisdom and guidance into the group. I think the magic of it is that these young people learn to be in relationship with each other, right? And they learn, they find a sense of belonging through that group. They feel oftentimes like that group is theirs, right? They often come up with norms and rules that are just idiosyncratic to their group, you know, and it kind of feels like a club that they belong to. I heard from a lot of group programs that shifted to trying to do that in Zoom and other platforms, that it really didn't translate terribly well. That energy, that kind of sense of camaraderie just dissipates a little bit, I think, when you go to the screen. Now, I think if you're starting a group from scratch on the screen to begin with, then you probably have an easier road to go because they don't know anything any different. I think there you start to get into some of those issues, though, of you know, confidentiality. Can I even speak openly, or is my spouse or kid sitting in the next room and can hear everything I'm saying? You know, I think it's much tougher to do for group mentoring, but I think there are some things where group mentoring is a better approach than one-to-one. I think particularly for young people that need a sense of belonging, and a chance to normalize their experiences, right? I know that if I'm a young person with a disability working at some job, I might be one of just a handful of people with disabilities that, you know, and I don't really have anyone to talk to about that. So if I can normalize my experience with other young people that are going through similar challenges, obviously that's going to be really helpful and impactful. So if you all are figuring out ways to make group mentoring work during this challenging time, I'd love to hear those stories, because I think you're probably unearthing things that you know, research has yet to catch up on. I'm very fond of saying that practitioners on the ground are always going to be several steps ahead of the researchers, because you're doing things out of necessity in real time. It's not until a year later where someone like me comes along and tries to study whether it worked or not, right? And so the true innovation in this field happens from you all, not from the research end of things. So I hope that answers your question. I think it's tough to do virtually, but I think if you can create that sense of group cohesion, and if you read that group mentoring supplement in that same series that I highlighted earlier, we do have one on group mentoring. We talk a lot in there about group cohesion and the things that facilitators and mentors can do to build that cohesion among the group. I just think it's harder to get everyone fully participating when you're not in the same room and you can't kind of, you know, bring in someone who's reluctant to participate. It's just like everything. It's just a little harder when you're doing it via technology. So.
Thank you, Mike. Your presentation was outstanding. I love all the participation. I would like to add something to Jenny's question. First of all, we did recently do a project that we were going to be reporting out on that was a group mentoring project, a group peer mentoring project, and it was very effective, I think, and we had a lot of fun doing it. It was extraordinary experience for all of us involved. But I think about whether you're talking about virtual group mentoring or in the real space, one of the oldest, most effective programs that exist, mentoring programs that exist, is AA. And it includes really three components. And one is the individualized peer mentoring. So you have a sponsor and you work with that sponsor, and that sponsor understands the challenges and has the experiences that you have. And then there is the group mentoring piece of that. And then I think the other part of that is the structure of the 12 steps. That is a continuous improvement piece that you build through the relationship. So I know that even in these times in big cities, communities all over the country, with the pandemic, that there has been a movement from those programs being online. I think it'd be very interesting to find out how effective and what strategies they've used to employ to make it happen. I know there were a couple more questions, and we're getting close to our time, or actually we're past our time. So I really want to thank everyone today for participating. Please, if there are questions, we'll look at the chat box, and perhaps we can pull those questions that didn't get answered and give you a response in appropriate time. And I want to especially thank Kristen Humphrey for her presence here today and her participation as a partner. We're sort of the National Disability Mentoring Coalition and Policy Works are sort of distant cousins from the past, and look forward to continuing to develop that relationship. Horace, you and your leadership in Florida, and of course Derek and his facilitation, and connecting us with Mike and this incredible amount of information. Thank you so much, everyone. And with that, we'll call it a day. Have a good Wednesday.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Mike. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.